All right. Welcome everyone to yet another webinar series from Heartfulness Wellness. My name is Kalpana, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. I am very excited. Some of you may know this, some of you may not. I mean, I wouldn't expect this, but I am a big proponent of psychology and mental health, and it brings me so much excitement to be in conversation with our guest speaker today on today's topic. Now, what it is, you might ask, it is trauma, breaking the silence and stigma. And I think this is something that requires so much of our attention and care and awareness around. And I'm so lucky to be able to talk to our guest speaker today. So without any further ado, I hope you're having fun. Go grab a glass of water, coffee, chai, whatever drink you prefer having. Come and sit with us as we talk about this topic today. So I'd love to start by introducing our guest speaker. So our guest speaker is Miss Tracy Pape. Tracy Pape is a licensed clinical social worker who graduated from the University of Notre Dame with a degree in sociology and concentration in Hesburgh study of public service. After college, Tracy was a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa, serving as a health education specialist. After returning to the US, Tracy began her career in serving individuals who had experienced trauma and mental health struggles. Tracy graduated with a master's degree from University of Chicago with a degree in social service administration and has been doing clinical work, trainings, supervision, and workshops to support mental health and healing from trauma both in the community and among professionals. Tracy began meditating with Heartfulness in 1995 and has been a trainer since 2000. Tracy is a passionate about the role meditation plays in mental health and supporting healthy communities. Thank you so much, Tracy, for joining us today, and I'm so thrilled to be conversing with you. So before we begin, how are you doing? How are you?
I am doing well here in Chicago. It's about 7 a.m. and a cup of chai sounds so good. So I love that you invited everyone in, and it ties into, soothing our nervous system. So I'm thrilled to be here and with the community that's watching, and I'm happy to be here with you as well, Kyle.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm so glad. So let's dive right in. My first question to you, Tracy, was essentially we hear a lot of these words, right? Stress, trauma, adversity, and sometimes you don't really understand what these mean. So can you throw some light on what stress, anxiety, chronic stress, anxiety, and trauma, what do these words mean?
Yes,
All of them.
it's such a good question. And I think in our current time with so much focus on wellness, there's been a feeling that if I feel stress, we overuse the word trauma. I'm traumatized, I'm triggered. And stress is natural. Difficult times are natural. Having big responses can be natural. That word is overused. So I think it's really nice to shed light on it and to talk about it, because a lot of people who are experiencing trauma hear these words and they're like, is that what I have? Is this what I've experienced? And this comparison. So I'm going to give it my best shot based on my years of experience. Trauma, if we look at the DSM, which is where the diagnoses lie, it's, something that's life-threatening or so scary that it kind of shatters our worldview or our view of ourselves. I think there's a big T trauma where it's an incident in a place and time that's overwhelming, and we, have a difficult time making sense of it. And we're very scared after this. I think there's also chronic overtime stressors that can also lead to trauma. There's a new adverse childhood experiences score that kind of marks these traumas over time. I believe that trauma is anything that happens to us that is so overwhelming and that we haven't been able to process, that it impacts our ability to love ourselves, love others, and feel connected to the community. So after sitting across from people, this is what I believe it is. I don't name it for anybody. When someone sits across from me, some people will call it an incident. Some people will call it a loss, a crime, neglect. I use whatever word somebody offers. But when something is stored in our body or in our hearts
Mm,
and we are unable to move beyond it, I think that's trauma. It keeps us stuck and it forms these very negative thoughts about ourselves or others. And
yeah.
so being able to name that we've been through something that's difficult, bearing witness, and I think we'll get into that in the webinar, that's the part of healing.
Yeah.
And I know in meditation, we talk about the invertendo, and it can seem very surprising to people that I'm passionate about trauma because it sounds like such a horrible thing.
Yeah.
But to sit across from someone and bear witness and watch them move through it and get back to their lives is a beautiful thing.
I can
And so
imagine.
that's what I'm hoping we can walk through in this webinar as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the one thing that caught on was how it trauma can change the worldview of other people, the world itself, and even and especially of ourselves. And also that there are two types, right? One can be more recurring,
Mhm.
especially if you're looking at families of abuse, right? This is something that can happen over years of at a time, or months or whatever the duration can be. And then there's another thing, like for example, loss of a loved one, that can also be traumatic, and that's more one time. So that was really interesting, the nuance on how duration can also differ on the different types. Of course, I'd love for you to get more nuanced with that over the course of our webinar, but to start, trauma, like you mentioned, can be an overused word.
Yeah.
So how how can you what is your advice on helping people navigate understanding what's happening to them?
Mhm. I think we start with presence.
Yeah.
I do think that, the heartful communication, there's an overlap here. I think it
Mm,
can be very distressing to sit across from someone you love describing their distress. And the first thing we do is to believe them, to bear witness. There's a huge difference in recovery time and how we respond when the person we're telling about our struggles is validating and empathic rather than minimizing or telling us we've got it wrong.
mm,
Um, so that's really important, trying to understand what the reality is for the individual sitting across from us or our loved one.
yeah. That's beautiful because I mean, like you said, so much of pain can be re-traumatizing if we're not invalidated. And if we feel like it's all in our head and that we're the crazy ones for experiencing all of this heaviness and this emotional roller coaster around an incident that's happened in our life. Thank you for that. So, what, what are some of the like more specific diagnosis around trauma? For example, you have things like post-traumatic stress disorder, right?
Yeah.
That has that has been a diagnosis that has helped us look at trauma from a more clinical lens and provide help that is timely, right? So, what is that specifically? Like, what are some of the
Yeah.
symptoms that you can see with people that have the post trauma? And how does it affect individuals that experience trauma?
An excellent question. So with PTSD, there's different categories of symptoms and, intrusive thoughts, avoidance, somatic experiences, nightmares, flashbacks, negative self-talk. I think the avoidance is a really important one because people who are experiencing trauma, their worlds get smaller.
Mm,
They avoid stimuli that may increase their distress.
yeah.
So if you have a loved one that's avoiding, it can look like anxiety and depression. There's very much an overlap. Um, I think the flashbacks where in a moment you experience that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. And I think it's an indicator if something happens and you feel like you completely have to check out. So
Mm,
the way that you get through something that's overwhelming is to just kind of shut down and check out. And what's really important to remember with PTSD, and to get a diagnosis of PTSD, you have to hit a certain number of symptoms over a prolonged period of time.
yeah.
And so a professional will help diagnose that. There's also something that in the trauma field, complex PTSD, which hasn't hit the DSM-4, But
Mm.
I really think it's important to name, because if we have other vulnerabilities, like if we grew up in a abusive home, if we've experienced ongoing systemic racism, poverty, war, and then something happens, that is complex.
Mm.
And it can be a little bit harder to untangle, may require more time. But I think the thing that I see that is the hardest to unravel the knot is when children, when adults experience trauma, something horrible happens, something painful. Very often, what we do is create a narrative about why it happened. And very often, it is there's something wrong with me. I deserve this to happen. I am unlovable. Variations on a theme of incredibly negative self talk.
Mm.
And that, and that's one of the factors in the diagnosis. But I think that's the one I work with people the most to challenge. And the reason we as humans do this is a universal response, is it gives us a sense of control, that what happened was so horrible. If I can figure out where I have control, like if if there's something inherently wrong with me, if I did something so bad, then I can keep it from happening again.
Yeah.
Which unfortunately these things do happen, and accepting that can be overwhelming. But the damage we do to ourselves with these beliefs, we close ourselves off to the world.
Yeah.
And I know Daji, just in a brief video that I saw, a French woman asked, how do we open up our hearts? And why do we close our hearts off? And he said, it's because someone hurt us or took advantage of us. And out of fear, we close them. And I feel like in a nutshell, that's what happens after something that is so harmful and hurts so much.
Yeah. I almost feel like my chest opening up, like my heart opening as I heard that, because it it can get so internally isolating for people that are experiencing these traumatic events. So they have maybe people in their lives telling them that, hey, move past this, move on, it's fine. And then they also have themselves telling them, you know what? And if we're like to talk with an example, like say for example, someone gets taken advantage of physically by someone else, right? You tend to think it's my fault. I shouldn't have gone there. I shouldn't have done this. Maybe I wore something, very provocative. Maybe I said something wrong. And like you said, that sense of control neurologically activates the part of your brain that helps you feel in control and feel in power, helps you make decisions. I'm talking about the prefrontal cortex. So
Right.
all that it kind of does, but then you're also deeply isolating yourself and not understanding that it's not you. It's not your fault. And I think that is something I think is very painfully relieving to kind of experience that, it's not your fault and it's not in your head. And you're right. I think there are a lot of people that blame themselves for what happened, and that's heartbreaking. So, um, my next question actually was, um, how can various experiences impact and create impressions in individuals who have PTSD or trauma? And what are some of the common ways that PTSD shows up in people? Now, you mentioned the symptoms, right?
Mhm.
But if we had to kind of look at this in layman terms,
Mhm.
simple observations that you'd notice, right? What would those be?
Oh, it's an excellent question, because I think one of the things is people can hide it really well,
Mm,
and they will avoid. Um, I think if somebody, what I've found is if we can share with one person what we're going through, because I think very often it's going to look like mood lability. It may look like lashing out at
mm,
somebody. So let's say, I'm glad you brought up you know, unfortunately, but I'm glad you brought up the violence, the sexual violence piece, because that is a lot of the work I've done. And I think it's important that we name it. It's painful to name. It's hard to shine a light on, but the numbers in the US are 1 in 3 women, so
mm,
this is a real problem. And that means 33% of women in this country are dealing with some sort of aftermath, and the numbers with men are 1 in 5. And what it
Yeah.
can show up like is anger, either turning in on ourselves or anger turning out on other people. And so what happens is our connections dissolve. People don't want to, I don't know what happened to Tracy. Why is she lashing out? She's not
Mm.
fun to be with. She doesn't want to go, to this crowded place. And so this is why erasing the stigma is so important, because you may have friends that act inexplicably agitated in a certain setting. Somebody may lash out at a time that seems incongruous with their personality. You're not sure what happened. And then the person who's behaving that way, or the person who's experienced something traumatic, has so much shame about this behavior. So there's the pain of the incidents, and then there's not knowing what to do with the symptom and kind of burning bridges or breaking ties with people because of the symptoms. And then there's isolation and loneliness. And I
Yeah.
think we are seeing part of the epidemic of loneliness, I think, is rooted in not understanding what is going on within us. And then we're on both sides of the coin. And then for someone we love who's behaving this way, offering grace, trying to look for what's underneath it, proceeding with care and curiosity.
Mm.
It's hard and it's messy, but we try to put someone in a single box once they have an episode. And then that only increases the isolation and shame.
Yeah.
So I think when you see any big emotions, of course, we want to set boundaries and we want to let someone know what's okay and what's not okay, but also understanding that there's really probably a lot of pain underneath that response.
Yeah. I think the thing that stuck out to me in this was that there's also shame of doing or expressing this anger. So what you're saying is that when people experience this, something one of the many things that you can see is that they hide it well, or you can also see the expression of anger essentially because probably a big boundary has been violated in some shape or form. So there's anger towards people in general or people of a specific kind, and also anger towards ourselves for
Yes.
either experiencing it or even acting on that anger to other people. And when you said that, the visual I had is like someone just burning up from within and their whole world is burning around them. It's kind of like you're at war with your own self and with the
Yeah.
whole world. And yep, the isolation can really trickle in when you just feel like you're on your own. And that's that. Yeah. I
And the way you said it is beautiful, because I think what happens is it's push down, push down. It's like that beach ball analogy. If you're at the beach and all you're doing is thinking of pushing that inflatable ball underwater, and all your energy goes to pushing that ball underwater, we can't sustain that. And then it comes out. So I think what we're doing here is modeling that middle path, that we can talk about it.
we can talk
But the
about it.
key to this is containment.
Mm,
We don't have to go through it all at once. We don't owe anybody our story. We decide how much or how little we talk about it, and that's where we have control. Not in
yeah.
blaming ourselves, not in
Yeah.
that. Talking about it is important. Figuring out, we don't want to, I've worked with people that over process and the grooves get bigger or deeper. And then there's some that never open it up. So it's finding out what works for you, but not being afraid to name that I've got this. I need to talk about it, but not right now. And then we're practicing those boundaries. And it's not like a pressure valve where
Mm,
I'm alone and then I blow up, and either blow up at others or blow up at myself.
mm. Yeah, containment. So essentially, that means that you're drawing, when I say drawing boundaries, to simplify that, kind of having rules for yourself on how much to talk about, how in deep to go in. Because if you have experienced something very painful in your life, it's not going to be easy to dig it up, especially if you try to push it away into a corner for a while. We don't want to go lug it out into the surface and make you feel really raw, very vulnerable, and very emotionally fragile, too emotionally fragile. So here, containment, my understanding is that you're drawing some rules so that you're not getting too deep into those emotions, but you're also not staying too far away where you're trying to distract yourself from it. You're kind of having a conversation with it and kind of saying bye. whenever you need to take a break. So rest and then conversing with your pain almost. Okay. Yes, that's very, very helpful in deciding it because there's this whole stigma, or not, I wouldn't say stigma, but this whole narrative around, you know what, stay away from your emotions, don't get too involved in them. If it what if it gets worse if you think about it, what if it gets worse if you talk about it, which is why some people choose to stay silent instead of just sharing it a little bit. So they're scared that it'll get worse, and it
Yes,
could get worse. It could.
right.
But there's also the other spectrum of people that want that stay in that, and they feel like they talk about it and engage with it so much that you feel like there's no way out of it, and
Mhm.
it almost feels like you're going down a downward spiral every time you engage with these emotions. So that's at
Yeah.
least how it kind of shows up for me. I think that it kind of gives a pictorial representation of what it can feel like. Thank you so much for throwing light on that. I think that's very important too. So
Can you just, want to add one thing, because you made me think of it. I think, especially for high achieving individuals, the idea of I need to talk about it more, I need to process it more, I need to get through this quickly,
mm,
that's counterintuitive. Because some people, if you tell one person, that's enough.
yeah.
And that idea, because what happens is we flood ourselves, because
Mhm.
that isn't how healing works. It's not a race, it's not linear. We can't force a flower to open, so it's time, love, space, and practicing boundaries, both within and without. And
Yeah.
that's what helps, bring safety. And then there is a piece, Besser van der Kolk's, we consider
Mm,
it like the book on the body keeps the score. So
yeah.
trauma can be stored in our bodies. And I think it can be released. There's a lot of really excellent research out there that in non-talk therapy, we can release trauma. So somatic experiencing, eye movement desensitization. I do believe meditation can really help. So there's a lot of pathways to healing. Some
Mhm.
may need to talk about it, some may not, and being open to all of these pathways to healing.
That's beautiful. Yeah. What are so how can people kind of understand when they need to get a professional opinion? Like,
Mm.
for example, what are the different types of traumatic events that you've seen that can classify under being very traumatic?
Yes, a lot of different ones.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is some, I worked on the south side of Chicago where a lot of these young adults experienced poverty, violence in the streets, substance use. That's a result of a system.
Mm,
And really feeling like what I'm going through isn't that bad because
mm,
they're immersed in it. So it's really interesting. The context matters.
yeah.
Um, and so, my hope is that this could go to anybody who needs it. I think traumatic loss out of the
Trauma.
lifespan or sudden um, violence,
Mm,
neglect. I think
mm,
when you are left to your own devices as a child, war, racism, acts of violence, not being able to have your basic needs met and fearing for your future. So homelessness, food insecurity. And there's things that would surprise me at times as a clinician that it impacted somebody so deeply, and
mm,
staying out of judgment and realizing there may be intergenerational trauma here,
mm,
epigenetics. So I did work with a woman whose mother was a Holocaust survivor.
mm,
She did not have any trauma that she could name and had all of the trauma symptoms, waking up with flashbacks, avoidance, hypervigilance. So I think she grew up with somebody who modeled this, and she, it's vicarious trauma, and she had all of those symptoms. And once it took a while for us, because I think what she was doing was like, what is wrong with me? And unfortunately, we so quickly go to, I'm crazy, or this doesn't make any sense. There must be something wrong with me. And if you sit with anybody, you know, with love and compassion and curiosity, it's going to make sense.
Mm.
And so when that opened up, she could embrace self-compassion. I know that we're going to get to that place
Yeah, yeah,
in this. I think it's the key for healing is that we deserve healing and forgiveness and love and compassion. But sometimes when we don't understand what's happening, it's hard for us to access self-compassion,
mm,
and we're not always going to understand it.
yeah.
So I help people do that dance.
Yeah, yeah. So what are some signs that, you could kind of tell? Like that
Oh,
that
yes.
for example, if I experienced this, something traumatic, what are some signs that I might experience that would tell me that, okay, you know what? I saw Kalpana and Tracy talk about this. It probably is that. I need to go get it checked. So, how could I kind of gauge into my own body, my own mind, and understand if what I'm experiencing is a post-traumatic response?
And I very much appreciate you bringing me back to it. I think I can get
Oh no, that's no.
remember. So I think if you are experiencing something that is impacting your quality of life,
Yeah.
or, our rule of thumb is 2 weeks. Like if you're having nightmares, we use the example of if you saw a car accident on the corner and every time you wanted to go to the corner, you couldn't go because of a memory of that car accident. And then you can't leave your house. So it's
Mm,
when your world starts getting smaller. I think when you find yourself having increasingly negative self-talk,
yeah.
of course, we need to look at, substance use, self-harm, suicidal thoughts, hopelessness. When friends or family are noticing something, if you're experiencing any of these things,
Mm,
going to talk to somebody is having someone bear witness so that you're not alone with it. You can understand what's happening in your body, what's happening in your heart, in your mind, and find ways to help you keep going. But any of those signs are a sign that talking to somebody would be very, very helpful, if not necessary. But
yeah.
especially anything that's risk, like any thoughts of self-harm, thoughts of hurting others, and any thoughts of,
Yeah.
hopelessness around life.
Yeah.
And
All
we
right.
see it. We see
Yeah.
it. If somebody has that thought, I want them to know they're not alone. And it's important data that, you know, you need more support and you need to feel connected.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's like a little checklist now.
Yeah, I've got that. I knew I had it.
Just touch base on, various areas. Hey, am I sorted? So I think that kind of gives a better picture on what it could look like in terms of an individual level. But earlier in our conversation, and I will get to the epigenetics part, but wanted to pause for a moment here. What are some of the ways we respond to a threat? You did highlight this in the first part, the fright, fawn. I'd like a little bit. I mean, could you elaborate a little bit more on what these different ways of responding to a stressful event, a threat, anything that's kind of scaring you? How do we respond to those things?
Absolutely. This feels like the key question for all of us to understand. So, I work with trauma clients and we talk a lot about a window of tolerance. When we're in our window of tolerance, we're in a relaxed muscle body. I get a little bit nervous before a webinar. You did a lovely breathing exercise. Help me stay in my window of tolerance. Noticing when we're getting out of our window of tolerance. Some of us get hyper aroused, which is activated. Our amygdala is perceiving threats everywhere. Some of us shut down into hypo arousal.
Mm,
Now, what's important and why I'm so glad you asked this question is the immediate response when we've experienced trauma, big T trauma, little t trauma, is that this immediate response is involuntary. We cannot control if somebody looks like somebody who harmed me, my
mm,
heart starts racing, my muscles tense, and I want to leave. My body is trying to keep me safe. And when the amygdala takes over, we're not accessing that wise mind.
mm,
So being gentle with ourselves, knowing that that initial response, whether it's to run, to fight, if I shut down, I can't control that. That
Mm.
is really important for people to know. Now, when we're practicing meditation, when we can exercise this pause, and this is why it is so, so important to talk about it. Because if you know what is happening, you can separate yourself, notice it, and respond effectively. So let's say you ask that wonderful question, Copen, about our friends. So let's say you're with somebody and all of a sudden she runs away. You're like, what happened? I have no idea what happened. And then you're
Mm.
mad because she left you at the farmer's market, whatever happens. She may have had a flight response and just got out of there. Now,
Mm.
if we can notice we're having it, pause, say, Kalpana, you know what? I'm feeling really overwhelmed. Can you just hold my hand and let's go over to the kale section? Then we're
Yeah.
responding effectively. So it's allowing that pause. And then the control is allowing ourselves to choose how to respond so that we don't get out of our window of tolerance. And this is why it is so important to talk about, because
Mm.
people who don't know what's happening, they go home and they're like, what did I just do? How am
Yeah.
I going to be friends with people when I just ran off? Or
Yeah.
fawning, where we're people pleasing. We're so afraid of hurting somebody. We say yes to everything. We never say what restaurant we want to go to. We never say if we want chai or not. Freezing is one of the most common, and that scares people because it's like, why didn't I do anything? It's
Yeah.
also your body taking over, trying to keep you safe.
Mm.
Now, when you said earlier, Kalpana, about it getting kind of easier and easier, almost like this spiral, if I respond effectively once, the threat is going to feel less daunting or
Yeah.
less life-threatening the second time. So it's
Yeah.
really hard. We call it, moving from comfort to courage,
Mm.
exposing myself to something that feels unsafe, even though once I'm grounded, I know that it is safe.
Yeah.
But the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, it's really important to understand. And that's also what you may see in loved ones,
Mm.
those responses, and reminding everybody that the initial response is involuntary. Our agency, where we have control, is how we respond to it once we notice it.
Mm. What is fawning? I've been yeah, curious to know that more.
Fawning is people pleasing, kind of rolling over.
Okay.
It doesn't
Yeah.
matter. Whatever you want. You look so great. Pleasing others to feel like we can be included.
Yeah, and to feel less like like prey almost. If we're going to look at our
Oh,
bodies
yeah,
and minds from a evolutionary perspective, that's very interesting. So we can be more aware of how we are responding to a stressful situation. For
yeah,
some people, it can be an exam you have to take that's pretty important. For some people, it can be an argument or a conflict that you have to address with your partner. For other
yes.
people, it can be going to a loved one's grave and revisiting them and just kind of conversing with them if they're no longer with you on earth. Um, so these are four things to kind of help you understand how you respond. Because, like you mentioned, the more you engage in, for example, these kinds of webinars, talking to people, learning more about it, and the more help you get, the more aware you can become about what you are experiencing instead of viewing it as like a tsunami that's taking over you.
Right.
And I think that's a beautiful way of uh, uh, helping us understand, these four responses. So, okay, now what are some of the causes? Now, for example, for trauma, we know that it's probably an event that happens in your life, ever since you're born to whatever, how old you are in the present moment. But is there like a genetic component to trauma and the experience of trauma? Like, can it be passed down from parents or generations?
I absolutely believe yes. Um,
Mm.
I think there's intergenerational trauma. I think epigenetics, some of us are biologically predisposed. I come from Southside Irish heritage. There's a lot of things I'm biologically predisposed to, and I'm so grateful I found meditation.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a given that we
Mm.
will fall into those, but we may be more likely. So it's important to know our family history. I went to an intergenerational trauma workshop by a friend of mine, Anita Manley. She's brilliant. And she had us really think about our ancestors and
Mm,
invited us to imagine what they were like before the troubles happened, kind of to understand with compassion, even possibly those that have passed on things that are difficult to handle.
yeah.
I do believe that healing now breaks a cycle and it's Herculean,
Mm,
but there are things stored in our body. I think we're still in the beginning of learning about this. And I know there are some studies within heartfulness, which I'm really excited to learn about epigenetics. But absolutely it's passed on. And when I do psychoeducation with clients, I talk about this biosocial model that you may be genetically predisposed, biologically predisposed, but also that your community, COVID impacted us, financial situations, health issues all impact how we feel. And
absolutely.
so there's a lot of things outside of ourselves that impact our mental health. And I think knowing that helps us access self-compassion.
Mm,
I really think it's linked. And, when I was talking about fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, I think what fuels those responses is shame.
mm,
When we experience something and we turn on ourselves, we convince ourselves we're not lovable, that we don't belong, that we'll never be enough.
mm,
And so teaching people the responses, teaching clients about epigenetics and intergenerational trauma, my hope is that can help them access self-compassion. And self-compassion is the antidote to shame. This
yeah.
shame is feeling like we're unlovable or there's something inherently wrong with us.
Mm,
And that is the indicator of someone really suffering and needing help. When they're
mm,
in that cave, they start believing that, because then we're separate and shame grows in isolation. It it is has a short half-life out in the world when other people bear witness. So I think
yeah.
all of those things are linked and part of a message I try to give clients and hopefully those who are listening to the webinar.
Oh, yeah. No, there was something very interesting that you mentioned. So, okay, so by shame, you essentially mean that when we feel like there's something inherently flawed or wrong with us, and this is a very general sense feeling that you have. It's not really, oh, I messed up in that exam. Oh, I had this difficult conversation with my mom. I think she hates me. No, this is a very
Mhm.
fundamental thing that, you know what, I am essentially wrong and I'm a bad person, not I did a bad thing. There's a big difference between these two. And so you said something so interesting that shame breeds in isolation, but the moment it
Yeah,
is spoken about or told to other people, like for example, if you were to tell someone else, I feel super ugly, I hate my body, I hate myself, if they are people that remotely love you, they'd not think that way, or they wouldn't have thought that about you with that much intensity. So
right.
that's so true. That shame is something that breeds in isolation, but not when it's borne witness to other people. And that's why I think our message that we're coming back to again and again is talk, share, tell
Yes,
people what's going on. Or if you can't find anyone in your family, reach out to anyone that you think is remotely capable of holding space for you in a safe way, um, or seek professional help, and
right,
and talk about it, write about it, express it. Even if you're an artist or anything, you're a dancer, runner, anything, just do anything to express. So that was very, very cool. That those lines were just amazing. And I want to dive into self-compassion so much too. And I think especially the part that you mentioned, that understanding that there is a biological component to it can help with going easy on yourself. Because especially when it comes to mental health responses or mental health issues, the stigma that's around mental health in general is that if it's in your mind, you can control it. And
right,
if it's something emotional or thought related, it's a you problem. It's not as, and this is something that we talk about a lot. If you have a cold, you're not going to sit and blame yourself. You might blame
right,
yourself for having ice cream, but you're like, okay, there's something wrong with my body. I need to help myself. I need to go get some tea. I need to go eat something. But if there's something traumatic or something that's happening on a mental level, you kind of shame yourself. Why are you like this? You're not
Mhm.
supposed to be like this. You're supposed to be normal. You're supposed to get your work deadlines in. You're supposed to engage with your family. Why are you zoned out? So it goes into blame in a way that it wouldn't if it was a physical health condition. It might be a little bit
Absolutely.
of that, but you'll start getting on healing yourself or, getting medicines. But yeah, that's a very beautiful. Do you have any thoughts to add to this?
I do, when you mentioned someone saying all these negative things about themselves, there's this myth of, if I validate somebody and they're feeling really bad about themselves or in a dark place, I'm going to make it bigger.
Mm,
The best thing we can do for a loved one who's suffering is to validate them. So let's say someone comes and says, I feel like I don't belong. I feel so ugly. Very often we want to say, in meditation, we can say, do your cleaning, or,
yeah.
it over, or out in the world, just don't think about it. Of course, you're not ugly. You're not. Those things actually can make us kind of crumble in on ourselves. Like, if it was so easy, I could have done it, So
Yeah.
what the way to short circuit that, and the most important thing when we're sitting across from someone, is to validate. Now, validation does not mean I agree. I would never say any of those things about you. What I can say is, I can see you're feeling really bad about yourself.
Yeah.
And that's balm for the soul. Now, it's painful when I see someone beautiful sitting across from me saying they don't feel beautiful. It's hard, and I want to argue with you. But what we want to do is say, I can see you're feeling really bad. It takes it down a notch, and then
Mm,
you can start engaging. So validation is so important. It's bearing witness to someone's pain. It is the antidote to shame. I can
yeah.
see you feel like you don't belong. I can see you feel like you don't have any friends. We know they belong. We know they have friends. But in that moment, we want to let them know we're hearing their pain. And I think that is what's going to help break the cycle. And validation is hard. And I'm telling everybody, it feels like you're doing nothing. And it's really, really important.
Mm. That's validation. Essentially, reflecting someone's sharing and not viewing it as something that you decide on. Do I agree, disagree? Do I refute with them, fight with them? You're just basically empathetically listening to them and accepting that it is their reality of the situation instead of trying to console or mask it by saying, no, it's fine. I deeply understand our need to comfort someone and when they're in pain, and oftentimes we choose to do that by telling them what they're believing about themselves is not true and that they are
Right.
so many things. While that can be also helpful, it can also help to meet your loved one where they are, which is, I hate myself. Okay, you hate yourself right now. I'm
And you
listening.
can get to the part where you tell them all the things you love, but start with letting them know you can see they're in pain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's dive right in. Honestly, why is being kind to yourself crucial when it comes to experiencing traumatic events like grief, loss of a loved one, violence, sexual violence? So, because there's a myth around, if you're kind to yourself, you're not going to grow, you're not going to change. That's the biggest myth see working with my clients on. And it's just something, it's the biggest myth I have to break because
Yeah.
people are scared if that I'm kind to myself, I'm going to get complacent. And that's not the
Yeah.
case. So, so why do you think kindness is needed?
Mhm. I'm pausing because it's such a beautiful question. I've worked with a lot of very high achieving individuals, and this belief that beating ourselves up moves us forward, that always finding something I need to work on. And being kind to ourselves is not letting ourselves off the hook.
Yeah.
Absolutely not. I want to keep growing. But we do harm to ourselves, when
Mm,
we zap ourselves of energy. Our brain is more agile and there's more neuroplasticity. I mean,
yeah.
with love, when we think about what we're doing in meditation or those studies about the plant, one plant was berated and one was loved. and the difference in the growth and the vitality of the one that was spoken to, for some reason, we really hold a boundary with how we'll talk to others, and universally we let loose on ourselves.
Mm.
It's and it's really hard to hear when I ask someone to say, what are you saying to yourself? It's sometimes like, you know, takes my breath away how horrible it is. And then the healing is sometimes the damage we're doing to ourselves. I know company said earlier, we're at war with ourselves. That's that internal war. So believing we're deserving love, forgiveness, self-kindness is the key factor to healing.
Yeah.
And I think it's why we meditate, to love ourselves. And so it's really difficult to immerse ourselves in meditation when we've wreaked havoc in there. And I think it can heal it. It can also make the journey very rocky and very hard.
Yeah. It's almost like the trench in Finding Nemo, right? There's basically a trench that two fish have to go to find the father's son. Father's a clownfish, and they have to go through a trench, which is like two big walls of rock with like a bunch of corpses, darkness, all of that within to pass. Because if they go over, they'll see jellyfish and they'll get stung by it. So
Mhm.
I think to navigate this and with healing, it's not rosy. Like you said, it
No.
can be very difficult before it gets better because you have to confront all of the things that you kind of tried distracting yourself from until this happened. And that's a very, very great point. And also, I mean, I think with kindness, the war is also when you don't authentically believe that, you know what, I'm a good person, I'm deserving of love. I think a lot of people who experience shame, myself included at some point,
Mhm.
felt that, like you said, I was harder on myself, but I would not dare to be harder on anyone else. I was, in fact, very kind to other people and not kind on myself at all. And when I'm in sessions with clients, we often do this role play where we kind of reverse roles, and I am the person thinking very negative things, like I'm the client and I'm saying that to that person, and I'm asking them, how does it feel to receive this from another person instead of your own mind? And it affects them so deeply. They feel like a pit in their stomach. And I'm like, yeah. So imagine what unconsciously happens when you think that about your own self, because the brain sometimes can't differentiate between what someone else is saying to you and what you're saying to yourself. It just knows how it feels because of what it's receiving, be it a thought or be it something that someone is saying. And that reminded what you shared reminded me of that, and it's very eye-opening to see the irony and the
Right.
hypocrisy that we have within ourselves and other people.
Well, in hearing that practice, it's a really creative, spontaneous exercise. And it made me think, what it does is it creates that barrier so that I don't have to take a risk. I can stay away because it's so scary to try to connect.
Mm,
And so we're just trying to create this place where we feel safe.
yeah,
And it's this cave of negative self-talk, but at least we know what to expect. But I
yeah,
think that's, the root of this epidemic of loneliness is a lot of people are in that cave.
yeah. How do you think people can start being kind to themselves, even if so? Yeah, we're talking about trauma right now, but I'd like us to go to any kind of emotional roller coaster or
Yeah.
heaviness, or stress. What is your advice on being kind to ourselves?
I think the first thing to do is when you're in an acute state, like in distress, practicing radical acceptance. So I'm in distress, I'm saying horrible things to myself. Getting through those 20 or 30 minutes without making it worse is
Mm,
really important. So do something to get through 20 or 30 minutes. And then once you're back into your window of tolerance, for me, I will put my hand on my heart, breathe, kind of name it. This was really hard. I was really hard on myself. I think reaching out to people who I love, doing something that helps soothe my nervous system, for all of us who do meditate, clean
yeah,
for a few minutes, it can really help kind of recalibrate you. There's a lot of different skills, I think, looking at what would soothe your nervous system and help you get to a place where you can see what's happening. Because when we're activated and we don't know it or notice it, we can wreak havoc. So we
Yeah.
need to notice it and come back down, because what I don't want is a second mess I have to clean up.
Mm.
So it's like allowing this cycle to go through and then taking care of myself. My current go-to favorite is Tara Brach's Reign of Self-Compassion.
Yeah.
Recognize what's going on, allow it to be there. That one's really, really hard. Investigate, and then nurture myself. So
Mm.
once you come out of that 20 or 30 minutes, the
Yeah.
reign of self-compassion is really useful.
Ooh, that's very interesting. And I've heard of this too by Tara Brach. She's
Mm,
awesome. And I think like you mentioned, the second one, accepting and allowing it to be there, that's the hardest part because
mhm.
oftentimes clients will come and say, you can tell me that no, but what do I do then? How do I kind of like navigate that? And that's the most uncomfortable part, how do I deal with the pain? And um, so okay, so you're saying 20 to 30 minutes, don't make it worse. That's it.
Yes.
And that's a very easy, I mean, and I wouldn't say it's easy, but it's a very straightforward thing to do. All right. You can do anything, but just don't make it worse,
Yeah.
which could don't try to, like, for example, for some people, consuming alcohol can kind of help loosen the nerves
Right.
and feel more lighter. For some people, going onto their phone and doom scrolling.
Right.
For other people, going into the fridge. I know I used to be an emotional eater, so
Mhm.
I'd go and eat
Too.
something that brings me comfort, and that could often lead to a cycle of just eating more. And for some humans, we see binge eating where you're eating a lot. So you don't do any of those things. Try your best
Right.
not to. Don't make it worse because you might regret doing that later. So just stay, do whatever, and then investigate and then nurture yourself. Oh,
Mhm.
that's one. Thank you for throwing light on that. Cool. And besides this, I think to close on or to kind of bring our conversation to a close, what do you think are some skills or techniques that can kind of help with the emotional roller coaster or with the trauma or navigating it? Like, what are some tools that you think we can kind of do to help us, kind of like a first aid kit?
I think it's nice. Sometimes I have people have a little self-soothing kit. I
Yeah.
think coming back to time and place. So five senses grounding is a great one, where you go through all the different senses to bring yourself back to time and place. I love dropping an anchor,
Mm.
which is very similar to the reign of self-compassion, but it's in the middle of it. So acknowledge what's going on, connect with your body, engage with the outside world. So I think coming back into your body, reminding yourself you're inherently safe right now, noticing where you're activated, whether it's muscle tension, heart racing, your stomach may hurt, and breathing into that space, nurturing yourself. I do think distracting yourself with something healthy, a healthy distraction, because
Yeah.
that's okay too when you're activated. And I can't stress enough positive supports, calling a friend, texting a friend.
Awesome. Awesome. This is very, very helpful. And I think sometimes, like, to help with witnessing it instead of being consumed by your experience, something that I've noticed helps with me is when I talk to myself in second person perspective.
Mm,
And that kind of self-talk can help ground you because, so for example, say you see someone that looks like someone that hurt you, right? It can be a friend that has taken advantage of you. It could be someone that looks like your parent that you recently may have lost,
yes.
and you start experiencing that kind of surge of emotions and you're on the street. What this could look like is, you're putting your hand on your chest like you do. It's like, hey, Kalpana, we saw someone that looks like mom today, and we're very, very, very shaken by it. And I know I'm feeling very all over the place, and
Mm,
yeah, that's scary. And I think what the
mm,
crux of what you did, which was so beautiful, is to acknowledge that it is scary because then you stop that war with yourself. No, it's not big enough. It's not a big deal. Oh no, but it
mm,
is a big deal. She looks like my mom. You stop that
mhm.
war and you're just coming at the facts. It hurts me right now. And I think also we're feeling ourselves as inherently unworthy or not good, or the shame also comes in when we can't confront the truth about ourselves, which is I am human, I am imperfect, I am going to make mistakes, and I am going to hurt, and I am going to experience pain and suffering in moderation or to some degree. What do you have any thoughts on that?
Oh, that was beautiful. It's, um, I think it is that I should be over this, I shouldn't be feeling this, that gets us hooked. So I think you worded that perfectly. It's when we judge our internal experience, if we can stay out of judgment, or at least when we catch ourselves judging, don't judge the judging,
Yeah.
allowing
Yeah.
it to be there. I am human. I'm not, we're going to fumble. We're going to have big reactions. We're going to hurt. People will hurt us. It's part of the human experience. I wish that wasn't true, and it is true.
Yeah.
There's inexcusable acts of violence, and with radical acceptance right now, the world is this does happen. So in order to help people heal, we have to acknowledge ourselves that violence does exist. We don't like it. How do we help people heal and move forward in a way that they can live their truth, live in alignment with their values, connect to themselves and others? And
Yeah.
it's really important work and sacred work. And I really love being in conversation with you about this, Kalpan. I've
Oh, I
left with
love
so
this.
many ideas.
It's so much. This was so amazing. I just with that, we kind of I mean, I'm pretty complete with the questions I had in mind for this conversation. I am just very grateful that I got to be a witness to this conversation and to be with you in conversation with you. I hope everyone's enjoying their beverages. um, and I think basically essentially what I'm taking away from this conversation is that trauma is something that's very real. It's not all in your head if something has happened to you. At the same time, there is some power that you have in your own life on how you want to engage with your emotions, on how you choose to, what path you want to carve out after this happened. And also, just because it happened doesn't mean that this has to be your entire life. And it does not mean that there's no hope coming along the way. And it does not mean that you are unloved and that you are flawed and that you are not worthy enough, because you are human, so you are inherently worthy just because you are human. And get help when you need it and talk about it. Reach out to people, reach out to people you trust. And more importantly, I think reading about this can really help, especially if you can't find anyone to talk about this to. Reading about it and learning more about your own experience can really help, and meditation, of course. Thank you so much, Charbrock. Do you have any final thoughts for us? What do you want? What are the few things you want our audience to take away from today?
I think the power of community, I felt it here with you, Kalpana. My heart was just overflowing when you were summarizing our discussion. Um, the importance of self-love and self-compassion. And for me, I think with hard things that have happened, it has been through meditation where I feel loved, and
Yeah.
that is healing. And it can really help to pause and to feel that, soothe your heart and that
Mm,
common humanity when you sit with others. It does feel like this, transmission is love healing our hearts. So I think
yeah.
meditation is really an important tool in our toolbox as well for those who are inclined.
Yeah. 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 Awesome. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we come to an end for our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us, Miss Tracy, and also thank you all for joining us, tuning in to our conversation today. We hope that you could take away so much from our conversation. I know I am, with what Miss Tracy has shared with us today, and I hope to see you soon, and I hope that this keeps the ball rolling, when you see people around you that might have experienced trauma, loss, emotional heaviness, and stressful life events. And yep, that's our hope. Thank you once again, Tracy, and bye everyone. Bye
Thank
bye.
you, Kalpana. Goodbye, everyone. I'm going to get
Bye
my
bye.
chat.
Yep.